It's been a while since we last visited Stadia, and last time we visited it, this happened. So this is from Google's streaming service, the game streaming service that made it into our disappointment build of 2019. And now we're bringing it back up because a few things have changed. So in theory, Stadia should have improved over time since the November time period when we looked at it. And also it's now got a free version of Stadia that didn't exist when we last reviewed the product. Separately, now Google has implemented its controller through wireless router support rather than going through the host system, which is where Google's original, if you remember it, negative latency claims came in the marketing. So finally, we can test the main claim of Google's Stadia product back when it launched in around November. And that's what we're doing today. We're revisiting Google Stadia to see if the latency has improved and focusing entirely on the latency side of things for the streaming service. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermaltake's ToughRAM RGB memory, available from 3000 megahertz up to 4400 megahertz in 8 GB by 2 configurations. The Thermaltake ToughRAM uses 10 addressable RGB LEDs for bright illumination and comes in both black and white kits of memory. Learn more at the link in the description below. So back when Stadia launched, we had a few issues with it that were covered across 3 main videos. One of them was the lack of serviceability of the controllers, which was overall a less product-focused issue and more of a philosophy issue of being able to maintain the products you buy, because this thing was designed in almost an Apple-like way where they've tried very hard to hide screws everywhere from sight, and some sort of compression was needed to get it apart, or a Dremel. That works also. But that was one of the smaller issues. The bigger issues were the slow and buggy rollout. There were problems with things like Chromecast Ultra. When we tested with Chromecast Ultra, which we're not revisiting today because it's basically irrelevant now with the changes made, but when we tested with it, we saw issues where latency was sometimes 300 milliseconds for total system latency, where on the PC you were sub 100 always. So that was a major downside at the time, where we really want to see sub 100 millisecond latencies for any game streaming service. So that was some of the basics. Now, those videos remain online. We'd encourage you to check them out if you're interested in the historical premise of it. But now we're looking at the newer change, which is that Stadia is actually public. Back in November when this launched, it was only available as a pro tier for founders, people who funded it initially, and that was a $130 pack that included the controller, Chromecast Ultra, and some other stuff like a code for access. And up until April of this year, Stadia remained a $10 per month option, but now you can actually play it free. And in quotes there, obviously you do pay for it somewhere, but not the same way as you might be used to from other services. So the way Stadia works is you can buy games from it. It's in that way like Steam or any other storefront. And you can play those games via streaming at 1080p 60. If you're not familiar with Google Stadia, the idea is that there's a remotely located server. It's got computer hardware in it that's mostly equivalent to about a mid-range to sort of high-end system, and that would include, at the time we reviewed it originally, something akin to a Navi class AMD GPU, for example, because that's what was actually in the Google servers. So that's kind of what the goal is. It's to do streaming without actually needing to buy a computer for use on site. And this is a very attractive idea. It's something that's certainly been tried before. NVIDIA's been trying it for years with Grid, which became GeForce Now. And Xbox has been getting into it lately as well. So what we need to do is revisit all this with the free Stadia base tier and look at how that's changed, see if latency's improved, stuff like that. And with all that, let's get into the revisit of Google Stadia in 2020. Our first impression upon logging back into Stadia was overall good. It's impressive to see that months after our subscription had lapsed, all we had to do was log into Stadia, go to the homepage, and hit play on one of the games that we had purchased, and we instantly got a 1080p 60 FPS stream. There's a button at the top of the page advertising Pro, but in general, the Stadia base experience is pretty much exactly the same as Stadia Pro, just without the 4K streaming capabilities. We have a sneaking suspicion that Google has overestimated how much its target audience cares about 4K streaming, but we'll discuss our opinions on all of that in a little bit. For now, let's focus on how the quantifiable performance has changed since launch in November. We developed a testing methodology for latency in our original Stadia piece, and we'll show some of the captures of latency testing while talking through this section. We're using that same methodology once again here for comparison. All of the hardware used back in our original piece, including the monitor, the video card, the RAM, the CPU, the motherboard, and the input devices, have all remained the same as last time. We have the same fiber internet connection as we did before as well. Windows version 1909 and the most recent WCL AMD GPU driver were used for the newer tests, and for this revisit, we're focusing exclusively on Stadia in browser on a desktop PC with a wired internet connection at 1080p. We measure full system latency by filming an LED that we wired to a mouse switch. By counting the number of video frames between the LED going out and the first on-screen movement, we can calculate the latency. When using a controller, we count from the first frame where the button is visibly depressed, and we film at 240 FPS, which gives us a test resolution of 4.2 milliseconds. Note here that the latency numbers we measure include the entire system, or the system latency, from the mouse to Google servers to the monitor. So any delays from our specific hardware would be included in the end result. These results are therefore comparable to each other and shouldn't be compared against others. First up, we have Thumper, a rhythm game where latency matters disproportionately more than in some of the other games. We measured an average full system latency of 86 milliseconds for Stadia back in November, versus an average of 73 milliseconds this time. That's a respectable 16% reduction in the average, but there's also a wider range of recorded results this time. The new worst recorded time is tied with the previous best recorded time. As before, this is an unimpressive result compared to the 23 millisecond average time that we measured when running the Steam version of Thumper locally. But the Stadia version is definitely playable, especially with the increase in responsiveness. At least, it is on the early levels that we use for benchmarking. Our viewers informed us last time that the more difficult stages of this game may be less forgiving of this latency, and expressed concern as well over the 80 millisecond numbers previously. So that's something to be mindful of, and if you're serious about this particular game or rhythm games like this, then you may be more sensitive to the increased latency than some of the other users would be. Metro Exodus is next. This one showed a 10% reduction in average latency since our last benchmark, but that still leaves it with an average 111 milliseconds latency at 1080p. Still not approaching even the worst numbers recorded when running locally. Metro was one of the most sluggish titles we tested originally, especially at 4K, where we measured response times approaching 300 milliseconds using the Chromecast Ultra. A large part of the issue seems to be that Google's server-side hardware might be struggling to run the game, adding performance-related latency on top of any network delays. Higher graphics settings mean worse performance on Stadia, but without any of the finer tuning that's available in PC games. Back to the new results chart, we're looking at the best case of about 108 milliseconds, whereas the PC was between 52 and 72, depending on the graphics settings. Although Stadia has reduced its numbers against itself by 10%, it still sits somewhere between 40% and 104% higher than the PC tests, depending on that tuning. Shadow of the Tomb Raider had the smallest reduction in average latency so far, down 5% to 105 milliseconds average. As with Thumper, the variance between runs is wider this time around, increasing the standard deviation. We saw a range of 20.9 milliseconds from 116.7 to 95.8 for this round of testing. Latency on Stadia depends on so many factors that are outside of our control, which is a valid point in itself, by the way, for people especially who aren't on $900 a month internet business lines where everything's guaranteed. And so you end up in situations where speed can fluctuate and performance can be inconsistent even within a single gameplay session. Typically, for something locally, we would try to control for this and narrow down that range, that standard deviation, as much as possible. But in this instance, it becomes a valid part of the test. It's less Google's fault in some cases and more a downside of game streaming in general as a concept, but it does make testing difficult. The new minimum is better than the old minimum, and the new maximum is worse than the old maximum. Overall, it seems likely that there's a reduction in average latency for Stadia since we tested it last year. At the very least, though, we can say that things haven't gotten worse. We'll look at the controller negative latency claims in a moment and some other benchmarks, but there's some stuff to talk about first. There have been some functional updates to Stadia as well. Specific resolutions can be chosen now, with caps of 720p 60, 1080p 60, or 4K 60 with Stadia Pro. Moreover, these settings can all be accessed from Chrome on a desktop. During our initial testing, most options had to be controlled via the Stadia app and weren't available on desktop, and resolution had to be capped indirectly by enabling low bandwidth mode. The desktop app seems feature complete now, except for the Google Assistant button, including the ability to stream in 4K, allowing us to permanently retire the Chromecast that we used in our initial testing. Google sent these Chromecast Ultras out with a special firmware version exclusively in the Stadia Founders Pack. And at launch, it was the only way for us to stream in 4K or use the Stadia controller wirelessly. Speaking of which, Google finally added the ability to use its Stadia controller wirelessly with devices other than its Chromecast Ultra that shipped with Stadia originally in the Founders Pack. So this was done in May of this year. It's a major change. The company also got around to adding Android support in June of 2020, and this was a major selling point of the Stadia controller. The whole idea was that it doesn't need to connect to the host device. It can instead connect to something device agnostic and work through a router, through wireless connectivity in your location, and use that for streaming the input rather than going through some host device and then through the router. And in that way, it is a brilliant concept, but it didn't really get executed for the initial launch. So instead, this connects directly to wireless. It theoretically reduces latency by skipping the middleman. And again, the major benefit to this approach is the device agnostic outcome. So the fact that this took months to get PC support added and a month further to add support for Android devices does make us a bit suspicious going into testing. Either way, though, we finally have an opportunity to do true, proper A/B testing for latency with a normal mouse connected to the test system versus a Stadia controller routed through the router and using the host system to still play the game. And this is where we'll be testing Google's controller connected directly to Wi-Fi versus local input. The first step of this test was to get the controller working, which turned out to be significantly harder than it should have been. The controller paired flawlessly using the new direct wireless connection to the workstation being used to write the script, a Google Pixel 2 phone, and the Chromecast Ultra from the Founders Pack. However, it completely refused to pair with the PC being used for testing. Even after a factory reset on the devices, it would flash the code for successful connection, do nothing, and then turn off. Contacting Google support yielded an immediate response. Apparently, nobody was in line for Stadia Live chat at 6 p.m. on a Thursday, probably because Stadia is actually flawless and no one needs support, but the technician suggested installing Windows updates and trying to set up the controller using a device other than the Pixel 2, since there are apparently, according to Google support, issues with Pixel phones not completing controller setup correctly. Points are awarded here for fast response times and calling back to check if the issue had been resolved. Points deducted, however, for not really knowing a solution, and especially for Google having technical issues with its own phone that it makes. This phone was also one of the only devices that actually supported Stadia at launch, so that's somewhat significant. In the end, the solution was to repeatedly turn the controller off and on and try pairing over and over again until it eventually worked, and then do all the test passes in one go while it's still connected. All of this was made extremely frustrating by the fact that the controller can only communicate errors using 2 colors of LEDs and the rumble motors. First up for this set is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, where there's a reduction in latency with the controller, but not a huge one. Our scores are measured in increments of 4.2 milliseconds, so a difference between averages of 5.8 milliseconds would need some more confirmation from other tests before we can call it a definite improvement. It's too close to our minimum test resolution to call just yet, and this game also had the widest range of results previously. Thumper shows no improvement whatsoever with the controller, with identical averages of 73 milliseconds regardless of what input device was used. On some level, it's a little encouraging to see that Google's wireless controller is just as snappy as a gaming mouse. But equivalence isn't really impressive here, not when negative latency was the advertising terminology. Once we refine our latency testing methodology further with things like higher speed cameras and monitors, we may test the Stadia controller versus a normal Bluetooth connection instead. Mortal Kombat 11 scored a worse average with the controller than the mouse, but certainly within the margin of error and within standard deviation. This makes Shadow of the Tomb Raider's moderate improvement even more likely to just be random variance run to run. Like Thumper, Metro showed no difference between using the controller and the mouse, pushing the needle firmly back towards it doesn't do anything. The minimum response time is improved over the mouse test, but the maximum response time is worse as well. Overall, we can say that any latency reduction from using Google's wireless controller is only a couple of milliseconds if it exists at all, and that becomes debatable. The Stadia controller doesn't magically make games more responsive. It's not negative latency. It can't actually predict your future inputs and do them before you. And the main usefulness of the wireless connection is that the controller doesn't need a Bluetooth connection. It doesn't need special drivers to connect to a device, to be used with a device. So no matter what, the controller can do nothing to address the poor system latency caused elsewhere in the pipeline. This would also be on Google's server side, where the servers struggle with things like 4K gaming because they're not actually supercomputers. They're not really much better than what you could build with sort of a medium to high budget these days in a DIY approach. So this controller is not going to fix those issues. 4K, at least with these more graphically intensive games, is still going to be latency bound or problematic for latency. And as a side note too, the controller does actually contain a Bluetooth radio, which is interesting, as it has interesting implications, but it doesn't seem to be usable for anything other than the Wi-Fi setup, at least as of right now. Connecting the controller to Wi-Fi requires configuration via the Stadia mobile app, and updating the controller requires connecting to Wi-Fi or wireless. So the controller requires a mobile device that can run the Stadia app. The other unique gimmick up its sleeve is the dedicated Google Assistant button, which still didn't work at the time we retested it on the desktop. The Stadia controller remains a bad value at $70, with no significant advantage over other input devices and zero user serviceability, something we showed when we did a teardown where it's assembled in the most insane way possible. We ended up using a Dremel tool at the time to cut it apart because it was so hard to get pulled apart with the way that the controller is all squeezed together. So if you're going to use Stadia, we'd suggest just using a mouse or a controller from someone else. Reviewing the overall packaging of Stadia as a service, there are two main problems with Stadia's structure. The first of which is that it makes no sense. Years of Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, Twitch, GeForce Now, and Xbox Game Pass have conditioned everyone to accept paying $5 to $10 per month on top of internet fees for access to a library of content. When someone first hears about Google's new subscription-based game streaming service, the natural assumption is that it's $10 per month for access to a big library of games. And when the subscription expires, that access, it would be assumed, is taken away. With marketing like this, most people unfamiliar with Stadia probably won't even understand if Stadia is really free or not. Instead, the games on Stadia are one-time purchases and then they can be streamed for free. But then there's the $10 a month Pro tier, and that one allows 4K streaming. The Pro tier also comes with some free games and some discounts added to it, so it's not really that complicated, but it's also not standard. And the problem here is that people aren't going to logically assume that Stadia is free, at least not the way it's set up right now. So Google doesn't push the message enough that Stadia is free, as in a per month sense, not a per game sense, obviously. And further still, making the service exclusive to paying and high-paying members only for the first 5 months, where beta testing is a privilege that you're paying to do, was really not the right move to communicate the end goal of making Stadia free in the sense of the monthly agreements as opposed to the per game agreements. So this was a squandered opportunity by Google, where it really had the opportunity to catch the attention of people who aren't invested in PC or console gaming as heavily, the people who would actually be in Stadia's audience. And that chance to hook the audience is gone, because you need to do that when you first launch, and you really don't get more than a first impression with hardware these days. And with games, that used to be true too, but that's changed a bit. Hardware, you've got one good shot and Google drops the ball on it. The second and more serious problem is that Google kills services. We talked about this before when we reviewed it originally. And it's the most obvious reason to be reluctant about buying into an ecosystem, especially when it's not just a pay per month to get access, and you're also paying for the titles, for the games you're playing. The one-time purchase model makes this far worse. If Game Pass were to go down, nobody could resubscribe to Game Pass. But if Stadia were to go down, everyone would lose access to a library of game licenses that were purchased individually. The end result comes out to the same thing. You can't play the games anymore, but the Stadia route feels a lot worse. That's equally true of storefronts like Steam, of course. but the universal pessimism about smaller services does make newer ones a riskier prospect. Steam could go under, and although Gabe Newell a long time ago promised that they'd make the games available, it seems as it grows that this is less and less feasible. But there's also a lot less doubt that Steam will make it as a commercial endeavor. It's a popular opinion as well, if you look around online, that Stadia will die with more of a whimper. And the more that people believe that, the more it's likely to become true. On top of all of that, the selection of games on Stadia is still painfully small. Before writing this piece, we visited the store to see what new games had come out, and were immediately annoyed by the lack of a search box. As far as we can tell, there's no way to search the games in Google's store. But a few seconds later, we realized why. The entire Stadia library takes up just a couple pages. And also, we should mention that the interface can change depending on how you're accessing the store. So we've been showing the full list from the All Games tab, as of this writing anyway, and if you remove the cleverly included DLC and special editions in that list, it gets a whole lot smaller. There aren't a ton of heavy hitters on this list either, and the ones that are there often have their own problems. Fighting games like Mortal Kombat and Samurai Showdown, and rhythm games like Thumper are more responsive than one might expect. But streaming isn't the ideal way to play them. Free-to-play games can't really be free on Stadia, because there's no sub fee, so users would be getting something for nothing. Destiny 2 is only free with a pro subscription, and multiplayer games like Destiny 2 suffer on Stadia without crossplay. With PUBG, mouse and keyboard lobbies reportedly forced to pad their numbers with bots, this becomes even more obvious. Most of these games are available on PC, Xbox, PS4, or even the Nintendo Switch, and some mobile devices. So if a potential customer already owns one of these platforms, there's not much motivation to buy a copy on Stadia instead. The ideal games are ones like The Division 2, graphically demanding, broadly popular, and capable of crossplay. It's easy to imagine someone without a gaming PC wanting to play The Division 2 with friends, in which case they could drop a flat fee of $30 for the game and be up and running within 1 minute, which in itself is impressive. We hope that Google invests more money in attracting titles like this one and pushing other companies to implement crossplay, rather than paying for more exclusive titles. Nobody is happy to see Stadia exclusives, because Stadia is nobody's first choice. It's a compromise for people who want to game on the go, or who don't want to spend $600 on a new console and the games, and that's fine. It just needs to be executed better. Competition with Stadia has been strong before, during, and after its release. GeForce Now finally officially launched in the wake of Stadia, which was promptly followed by publishers jumping ship and pulling dozens of games from the service. That was presumably in order to make them exclusive to other services at some point instead. Still, it's one of the most common sense game streaming services out there. You pay a subscription, you log into Steam or another storefront on NVIDIA's hardware, and you play the games you already own. We haven't tried it in years. It was Grid when we last looked at it, but we may revisit it in the future. PlayStation Now allows streaming PlayStation games from multiple console generations, either on PS4 or a PC, and the strongest competitor yet may be Microsoft's Project X Cloud, currently in beta and scheduled to be added to the $15 per month Game Pass Ultimate subscription for free in September. Game Pass is already a popular service that gives access to a large, rotating library of downloadable games on both PC and Xbox, and Game Pass will allow streaming a significant chunk of those games. At this point too, now that it's been so long, maybe the public opinion, the pendulum of it, is starting to swing back in favor of Google Stadia. Whenever something becomes the internet's punching bag, as we've all seen, it's often that there's some immediate follow-up where people say, actually, it's good. And over time, that opinion, if the product starts to improve, will grow in its popularity. So Stadia is at the point where maybe it can start tipping people in its favor, but it still has the sort of overbearing weight of Google and its propensity to kill services overbearing on the actual service, on the product, because there's always that fear that maybe they'll just yank the rug out from under it at any time, and then everything's lost at that point. But there are definitely good points to Stadia. It's sort of free. It's extremely convenient when and if it works. We still have issues with some of the phones. Google's Pixel 2, Google admitted to us in a customer support chat that it's having issues with some of its Pixel devices and working with Stadia. This is a fundamental issue and requirement of the platform. So damn it, it should work, Google. But either way, it's gotten easier than when it first launched. There's no more waiting for installs or downloads with things like Stadia or other streaming services. This is obviously very attractive, especially in areas where internet is poor enough that you don't want to wait forever to download a 100 gigabyte game, but also good enough to support streaming. That's the key issue, though, is that still in a lot of parts of the world, and definitely a lot of parts of the US, the internet quality is kind of mixed. So these services will take a little bit to really catch on, but it's getting to a point where, in terms of internet quality, once the services are good and the server-side hardware, which is what we've had the most problems with, is good, then it's a feasible idea. The Pro subscription comes with some free games. It comes with discounts. There's planned integration with YouTube. It's hard to review something on a promise. We certainly haven't done that in the past, so we're not going to review this on the promise, but the idea is that integration with YouTube might make it exceptionally easy to do game streaming, for example, by working all through the same device, which is every Silicon Valley company's dream to have an ecosystem that it fully controls. Other good points too, Stadia really does work with a good enough internet connection, and even at the free tier, some of the games are absolutely playable. Some of them are more playable at the free tier, actually. The 4K versions of Metro and Shadow of the Tomb Raider are unpleasantly sluggish. It's noticeable in a big way, and you can also see that in our original coverage. Other graphically intensive games would have the same problem as well. Google's server-side machines are equivalent to mid-range gaming desktops, all using AMD GPUs, so none of the games are capable of using NVIDIA-exclusive features or have higher-end video cards in them. Device support has gotten much better since launch, when basically only Pixel phones were supported, but Apple devices are still conspicuously absent from the list. It doesn't really matter either whose fault that is, Apple's or Google's, because in this arena, they're not really, at least right now today, direct competitors, and so Google should be trying to support those devices to get the widest reach it can, especially for an audience which has otherwise been agnostic towards its computer hardware up until now. A lot of the people who want this stuff probably don't really have an investment in the computer gaming ecosystem, so supporting the widest range of phones just to set it up and get playing or streaming on the phone is a worthwhile investment for Google if it makes it, rather than trying to shut out a competitor in the phone market for a different market that it's trying to get into. So the Stadia app can be downloaded on iOS. It can be used to manage the settings. It just can't be used to stream the games. Overall, the best feature of Stadia is the fact that it doesn't require a subscription, and all it takes to try it out is the cost of the cheapest game on the store, and that's currently $3. And we'd be happy to see Google expand Stadia with more cross-play capable games. That seems to be the biggest weak point right now, and make it actually become a viable business. But again, we'd be surprised if Google actually does commit to supporting this product long term because of its history of killing products. And then finally, the latency is still a problem in some of these scenarios we've shown. It's certainly not negative latency. That was absolutely bullshit advertising by Google. And the controller in our testing doesn't really seem to be meaningfully better in any wide sweeping way by using the wireless option rather than going through something wired like a mouse. So the best way to use Stadia still seems to be a wired Ethernet connection with a mouse and a keyboard. That's something we showed in the original content. If you want to see a lot more depth on that with extra testing at different resolutions, where higher latency issues come into play, check the original content. Today we're focusing on revisiting the stuff that wasn't able to be used back then, like the controller stuff. So anyway, overall, it does not appear that the latency has improved in a meaningful way. The service has added to it, but it's still kind of padded by things like DLC, season passes, stuff like that. So Stadia has a long way to go. Whether or not Google can get it to a point where it's actually a widespread commercially viable service will really hinge upon whether Google is willing to invest the money required to get everything up to speed on all mobile devices and to get the latency as controlled as it can be on the games where it's still kind of out of bounds, especially for those higher graphics setting games where it starts to become untenable rather than the lower graphics quality games where it's fine. It doesn't really matter as much. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. We will revisit the topic of game streaming with other services if there's sufficient interest, so please let us know in the comment section below which services you'd like us to look at, if you'd like us to look at any of the others. And as always, you can support us directly at store.gamersnexus.net by picking up things like our brand new component PC t-shirt on the store, or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.